Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome to you all. At the onset, I would just like to thank the Cobalt Institute for convening this conference and for affording core consultants the opportunity to address you at this forum. The DRC and Katanga Province in particular has been referred to as the richest region in the world based on its mineral wealth. Katanga boasts around 180 mineable metal resources, with 765 new exploration and mining permits having been granted to 81 countries or individuals over the recent years. Katanga hosts the Central African Copper Belt, extending from Angola through to the DRC and into Zambia. Despite being one of the greatest metallurgenic provinces in the world, development in Katanga has lagged global development. This can be attributed to ongoing political instability and social unrest and poor infrastructure. Core Consultants has been requested to provide some clarity on these issues with respect to how they might affect the cobalt industry. So to kick off, let us address the first issue, that of political instability. In July last year, Barack Obama signed the new Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, which came into effect in April this year. Just to provide some background, for nearly a decade, conflict minerals have helped sustain war in the DRC. Consequently, from April, when supplying U.S. companies with either raw materials or products in the supply chain or end products, ultimately the company will need to demonstrate provenance of the raw material. This includes, for example, a cell phone manufacturer that incorporates coltan in its manufacture. They will now have to demonstrate that the raw material used was not a conflict mineral. Along these lines, questions of what is considered a conflict mineral have created a lot of negative press and uncertainty within the cobalt industry. So to clarify, this bill does not include cobalt in any form. The new Dodd-Frank Act pertains specifically to mines in the Eastern Congo or the so-called conflict zones, and the affected minerals include what has become known as the 3TG: tin, tungsten, tantalum, and gold. This map just demonstrates that the copper and cobalt belt is about 1,200 kilometers away from the conflict zones and is situated on the eastern side. The minerals that occur within these zones are also shown, and you can see what is very prevalent are the gold and tin, and then what is not shown here is the coltan belt, which extends from Rwanda up through to Uganda. A major consideration when conducting business in a country characterized by political instability is the question of whether property rights will be respected and upheld. In 2007, President Joseph Kabila instituted a review of all mining contracts granted by the previous government regime, ostensibly to maximize benefits for government and local communities. The contracts in question were those signed between the two wars, 96 and 97, and 1998 to 2003, as well as the transition period from 2003 to 2006. A total of 63 mining rights were identified for review. Mining contracts were classified like a robot, or traffic light, as some of you may refer to it, and were either green, orange, or red, acceptable, up for negotiation, or susceptible to being cancelled, necessitating renegotiation with the former concessionaire. At the time, Global Witness, an NGO that monitors corruption of natural resources, raised concerns about this review process, questioning its independence of the DRC Contract Review Panel, which was entirely comprised of government representatives, and the lack of clarity and the transparency in the contract review process also gave cause for concern. Happily, at the moment, all mining rights on the copper-cobalt belt, with the exception of First Quantum, are now resolved. I believe that First Quantum have taken the issue to The Hague. There is also the question of whether the possibility exists for another mining rights review. We at Core Consultants do not believe that there is much risk of this happening. Firstly, as there are contracts in place with the current government, and secondly, that the initial reasons cited by government for the renegotiation in the first place revolved around government changes and particular ministers who the government claimed negotiated dishonestly or in bad faith. With the mineral issues now largely resolved, the main issues affecting the producers currently is that of logistics, and I would like to please spend the remainder of this presentation focusing on the present situation as well as some of the initiatives that are underway in order to resolve these freight restrictions. We begin with an analysis of the published expansion plans of the mining companies. We then examine the present and future import and export routes via Katanga's provinces, which will be available to handle the material. We'll then end off this presentation with some comments on how some of these infrastructural challenges are presently being addressed. In order to understand the freight challenges, we need to consider the total projected mining production from the DRC, including that of copper, cobalt, and zinc. With an LME price of $16.56 per pound for cobalt on the 18th of March, there is the risk that if there is a choice between shipping cobalt or shipping copper, companies would choose to rather lock in copper profits. However, as the volumes of cobalt pale in significance compared to that of copper, we believe that this risk is nominal. That being said, if logistical issues are not adequately addressed in the near future, this would impact exports of all commodities originating from the DRC. At present, around 405,000 tons per annum of copper, cobalt and zinc is exported out of Katanga Province. This figure is expected to increase to around 530,000 tons by 2016, and if all announced capacity comes to fruition, then we expect that the annual mining rate will be close to 1 million tons by the end of this decade. I must just say that it is not within the scope of this presentation to comment on whether we think all of the material will come on stream. We've merely listed those announced plans. Moreover, we expect that within the next 5 years, producers will be competing with around 1 million tons per annum of copper emanating from Zambia for freight capacity. The only issue that we believe will frustrate these plans and prevent the said capacity coming on stream is either political unrest in the DRC or its neighboring countries, another financial crisis, or the inability of rail and roads to handle the demand for raw materials. Clearly, infrastructural capacity is the Achilles heel in the supply chain. If we consider the current export and import routes, until recently the only viable options for export from Katanga Province have been either number one, small volumes to the port of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, or the NorthSouth Corridor routes via Zimbabwe and Botswana. Despite having to cross up to 4 borders and the large distance, the North-South Corridor is expected to remain the preferred route. South Africa is a major supplier of goods to its southern African neighbours, and therefore the North-South Corridor presents the opportunity for return loads, which has a positive effect on transportation costs. However, as volume flows begin to increase, governments get their plans in order, and the one-stop border post service, which has become known as the OSBP, is implemented to reduce time delays, alternative routes to the North-South Corridor will become viable. At present, the Beira Corridor is seen as a good alternative to the North-South Corridor, though, as with the North-South Corridor, choosing this route requires crossing 3 borders. Dar es Salaam, as we mentioned, is a viable route, but is only conducive for small volumes and there are long delays. The Trans-Capri Corridor is also seen as a good long-term prospect owing to the possibility of return loads and that it takes half the time as the North-South Corridor. Over the longer term, we believe that Lobito will become the most viable route for trade with Europe and America, while Beira and Dar es Salaam will become a sensible route for trade with the Middle East and Asian countries.